mechanisms are called when there is a dispute that cannot be settled amicably between the two contracting parties. So, in the case of an insurance, such disputes are going to be much fewer as compared to what we see in a traditional contract. And how can the disputes be fewer? It can be fewer only when the events that can actually result in an insurance claim being filed are being very clearly defined. Not only they are very clearly defined, they should be in a position to be able to estimate it in advance, but in a creeping expropriation kind of action, it is going to be very difficult to determine what are the different actions that will be under the umbrella of creeping expropriation, or it will be very difficult to even recognize it till it has actually taken place. So, because of these factors, the insurance in this sector is going to be very difficult. See, normally what happens is there is going to be a lot of trust between the project company and the government in terms of smooth functioning of the project company. So, unless until that trust is not there, it is going to be very difficult for the project to function. But sometimes the governments can actually misuse the trust and can actually deliberately do some actions that can actually benefit that can actually harm the project. So, there is no clear boundary between the legitimate use of state power or deliberate harassment of the project. So, how do we actually say that it is for a legitimate reason that the imports and exports are being held at the docks? How do we say that the delay in the issue of permits is because of some certain valid reasons? Or it is also possible that the government wants to extract something from the project company, and therefore, it is a delay in giving some permits. So, the boundary becomes very clear, and we are not able to say for sure whether the state is following its the rules as per the legitimacy that it has been entrusted upon, or it is trying to result in actions that can deliberately harm the project company. And it is also going to be very difficult to prove that the project would not have defaulted on its payments if these creeping expropriation acts had not taken place. So, when we actually claim an insurance, what do we actually indicate, right? That the project has not been able to honor its payments because these actions have taken place. So, that is if there is let us say an earthquake, or if there is a sabotage, then it is going to be very clear to identify that the project have not been able to function because of these actions. But it is going to be very difficult to prove that in the case of a creeping expropriations. How are we to prove that it is because of these actions that the project has not been able to honor its commitments? Because it is going to be so difficult to establish a causal relationship between the occurrence of the event and the non-payment to debtors or investors, it is also going to be very difficult to actually file creeping expropriation. So, these are some of the challenges, and if we are actually going to take a loan for insurance for creeping expropriation, then we need to be aware of these kinds of difficulties, and therefore, some of the events have to be a lot more clearly defined to ensure that the disputes after the event has occurred is very minimal. Okay, now let us continue our discussion on political risk. In the previous lectures, we have talked about the various types of political risk and the impacts that it can actually have. Now, we will move to the next part of it, that is after having identified what is political risk, after having identified the different forms of political risk, let us see how we can actually go about and mitigating them. So, we even looked at specific instances of mitigating political risk. For example, if you look at one of our earlier lectures, we talked about investment risk. Under investment risk, we talked about currency convertibility and repatriation, and under that we said there are some specific strategies that project companies follow to mitigate this investment risk. So, one of it is enclave projects, that is you actually create a project where the cash flows actually come in an account that is set up overseas, and we also looked at setting up of overseas reserve accounts. It could be overseas expenditure account, it could be overseas debt service reserve account, and so on. So, these are some of the ways that we briefly looked at in terms of mitigating the political risk. So, in this lecture we talked about other mechanisms by which we can mitigate political risk. The first is what is called as a government support agreement. Okay, in fact, this is one of the important contracts that the project company executes. and this is an agreement